The scent of dry rot always hit the back of my throat before I could see the damage. I stood on the stone-pillared patio, my heavy canvas tool bag resting against the toe of my work boot, staring at a hairline fracture running up the exterior stucco of the main load-bearing column. The afternoon breeze was warm, carrying the distinct scent of impending rain and blooming jasmine. But all I could focus on was the subtle, dangerous sag of the roofline. A white sheet of heavy stock paper, an eviction warning wrapped in the polite language of a structural safety lease termination, was folded in my back pocket. I hadn't come here to be a guest. I had come because Greg, my best friend, was deployed 6,000 miles away, and he had asked me to check on the house. He didn't know about the paper, but I did. She was standing just inside the threshold of the sliding glass doors. Amelia Daniels. For the last 10 years, she had just been Greg's mom, a peripheral figure of authority who offered us iced tea and quiet smiles when we tracked mud through her hallway. Today, the dynamic was entirely different. The sheer white curtains billowed outward, catching the coastal breeze. She reached up, her fingers gripping the edge of the fabric. She wore a sleeveless peach dress, the V-neck crisp and elegant against the weary set of her shoulders. Her dark hair was loose, catching the afternoon light. I stood facing her, the dark fabric of my work shirt absorbing the heat of the sun, my back completely to the driveway. I had tried to tell her the crack was minor, a settling issue, offering a comforting lie to ease the visible tension around her eyes. My best friend's mom drew the curtain slightly and said, "Look properly this time, Carter." She pointed not at the superficial crack, but at the exposed joist hanger just above the doorway header. The metal was twisting. The sheer weight of the upper balcony was pulling away from the ledger board. I stepped closer, my boots quiet on the flagstone. I didn't look at her face. I looked at the wood. The grain was splitting. The lag screws were pulling out by a quarter inch. If a heavy storm hit, the entire overhang would come down, taking the front facade with it. Vance Property Management wasn't just bullying her with a lease loophole. They had found a legitimate hazard, one they were responsible for maintaining but were weaponizing to force her out of a rent-controlled agreement. The silence between us stretched out, heavy and absolute. I set my tool bag down. The metallic clink of my framing hammer against my speed square was the only sound. "They gave you 14 days on the notice," I said, my voice low. "This isn't a patch job. This requires shoring up the deck, pulling the fascia, and installing a new microlam beam." Amelia let the curtain fall back into place, stepping out onto the porch. She crossed her arms, a defensive posture that didn't hide the slight tremor in her wrists. "Vance's inspector is coming back in 12. If it's not to municipal code by then, the lease converts to a month-to-month market rate, or I vacate." She looked out over the lawn, her profile stark against the gathering clouds. "I can't afford the market rate, Carter. And I can't afford a structural crew right now. Greg can't know. He's got enough to worry about over there." I watched her twist the silver band on her right index finger. The world felt suddenly very small, reduced to the span of this porch and the fragile wood above us. I didn't offer a sympathetic speech. I didn't tell her it would magically be all right. I reached into my bag, pulled out a laser measure, and turned it on. The red dot hit the ceiling. "I'm going to need to pull the drywall inside the entryway to check the king studs," I said, writing a number down on the back of the notice. "I'll handle the permit application down at the county office tomorrow morning under my contractor license. We start demolition at 6 a.m. She turned to me, surprise breaking through the tight mask of her composure. "Carter, no. You run a business. You have clients. This is a massive job." "My current client is waiting on custom milling that's delayed a week," I lied smoothly. I wasn't going to let her lose her home. I couldn't explain why the thought of her packing up these rooms felt like a physical weight in my chest. It was just a fact. I walked past her, giving her a wide berth, maintaining the boundary of respect that had always defined us. I felt the sudden, desperate urge to reassure her with a hand on her shoulder, to physically transfer some of my groundedness to her. Instead, I shoved both of my hands deep into my pockets, my knuckles brushing against loose screws. I nodded toward the door. "Show me the inside wall." The next 3 days were a blur of sawdust, reciprocating saws, and the dull, rhythmic thud of a sledgehammer. I sectioned off the front entryway with thick plastic sheeting, creating a barrier between the chaos of the demolition and the quiet order of her living room. The dynamic shifted. I was no longer the kid who used to raid her fridge. I was the craftsman, operating in my domain. Amelia stayed out of the drop zone, but she was always present. She managed the logistics, handling the phone calls to Vance's office, organizing the tarp placements, and silently placing a glass of ice water on my workbench every 2 hours. On Thursday afternoon, the sky turned a bruised purple. The humidity spiked, thick and oppressive. I was up on the scaffolding, my shirt sticking to my back, trying to muscle a temporary 6x6 shoring post into place before the rain hit. The old beam was entirely compromised, spongy with rot. If the wind caught the upper deck now, the structure would fail. I had the hydraulic jack positioned, but the sheer weight of the house was fighting me. My muscles burned, my grip on the heavy timber slipping slightly from sweat. "Hold the level," I grunted, not looking down. Amelia stepped under the scaffolding without hesitation. She didn't flinch at the groaning wood above us. She took the 4-foot aluminum spirit level and pressed it against the side of the post, her eyes locked on the little green bubble. "Push it a 1/4 inch toward the door," she said, her voice completely steady amidst the rising wind outside. I shifted my stance, driving my shoulder into the rough grain of the wood, bearing the weight. "How is it?"
"Hold,"
she commanded.
"right there. Plumb."
I triggered the hydraulic jack, locking the pressure, then rapidly drove 3 structural screws into the top plate with my impact driver. The sharp mechanical rattle echoed through the empty hallway. The house settled onto the new support with a heavy, final sigh. The danger passed. The roofline was secure. I climbed down the ladder, my breathing heavy. The first fat drops of rain began to hit the plastic sheeting over the missing window frame. I looked at Amelia. She was still holding the level, her knuckles white. She looked at the secured post, then up at the ceiling, then finally at me. The relief that washed over her face wasn't a dramatic breakdown. It was a quiet, profound unspooling of tension. "You got it," she whispered.
"We got it,"
I corrected, wiping sawdust from my forehead with the back of my forearm. I stepped closer to take the level from her. Our fingers didn't brush, but the proximity was a sudden, grounding force. In the dim light of the tarp-covered room, with the storm breaking outside, the noise of the world was entirely blocked out. There was only the smell of fresh-cut pine, the sound of the rain, and the absolute certainty that she was safe under this roof. It was the first time in years my mind felt completely quiet. By the end of the first week, the routine became an anchor. I arrived at dawn. She was already at the kitchen island, a travel mug of black coffee waiting for me by the door. We barely spoke in the mornings, sharing a comfortable silence that felt heavier and more significant than any conversation I'd had in my adult life. I spent hours measuring, cutting, and fitting the new Douglas fir beam. I was meticulous. I didn't just want to pass code. I wanted it to be flawless. I used a mortise and tenon joint for the main connection, a detail no inspector would demand, but one that ensured the wood would lock together like bone. I was on my knees, sanding the edge of the baseboard when the mail carrier dropped a certified letter through the slot. Amelia picked it up. I heard the sharp intake of her breath. I stopped the sander, the sudden silence ringing in my ears. She walked slowly into the entryway, the heavy stock paper trembling in her hand. "Vance," she said, her voice hollow. "They're invoking a clause in the municipal emergency code. Because the facade is currently open to the elements, they're classifying the property as uninhabitable. The inspection isn't in 5 days anymore. It's tomorrow at 10 a.m. If the wall isn't sealed and the permit isn't signed off, I have to vacate by Friday." I looked at the gaping hole where the exterior drywall and siding should be. It was at least 14 hours of work. It was currently 4 p.m. Amelia dropped the letter onto my workbench. She didn't cry. She just looked incredibly tired, as if the fight had finally drained the last reserve of her energy. "I should start packing," she said, turning away. "You've done too much already, Carter. I can't ask you to kill yourself over this." "Amelia." I spoke her name sharply. It was the first time I hadn't used a respectful distance in my tone. She stopped, looking back over her shoulder. I stood up, brushing the dust from my jeans. I walked over to the workbench, picked up the letter and folded it precisely in half, then in quarters, and dropped it into the trash can. I looked at her, holding her gaze. I didn't offer empty comfort. I dealt in reality, in measurements, in load paths. "The structural inspection passed yesterday," I stated, my voice calm, stripping the panic from the room. "The beam is rated for twice the load. All that's left is the envelope: insulation, vapor barrier, exterior ply, and weatherproofing." I picked up my tape measure and clipped it to my belt. "I'll need you to run to the supply house before they close at 6. I need 4 rolls of R15 batting, 2 tubes of acoustic sealant, and 3 sheets of half-inch OSB. I'm going to set up the halogen work lights." She stared at me, the fatigue in her eyes fighting a sudden spark of hope. "Carter, it's an all-night job." "Then I'll need more coffee," I said evenly. She didn't argue. She grabbed her keys and walked out the door. The moment she was gone, I leaned heavily against the newly installed post, rubbing my temples. My shoulders ached. But the thought of Vance standing in this living room, handing her boxes, made my jaw lock. I turned on the heavy yellow work lights, casting harsh, stark shadows across the framing. I began to cut. At 2 a.m., the house was silent except for the hum of the halogen lights and the rhythmic staple gun driving into the vapor barrier. I was exhausted, my movements mechanical. Amelia was sitting on a drop cloth in the corner, wearing an oversized gray sweater, watching me. She had refused to go to sleep. She handed me tools when I pointed, held the tape measure when I needed a long run, and kept the coffee coming. "You're a perfectionist," she noted quietly, as I carefully taped a seam in the barrier that would be hidden behind drywall forever. "Water finds a way," I replied, my voice raspy. "You don't leave gaps." She pulled her knees to her chest. "Greg told me once that you were the only guy on his crew who never cut corners. He said it made you hard to work with, but impossible to replace." She looked down at her hands. "I'm sorry I'm dragging you into this mess. It's embarrassing, losing the house because of a technicality." I set the staple gun down. I walked over and sat on an overturned drywall bucket a few feet away from her. The proximity was safe, but the hour made everything feel stripped bare. "It's not a technicality. It's a predatory system designed to force out good tenants," I said, my tone flat with fact. "And it's not a mess. It's just a repair." She looked at me, her eyes searching mine in the dim light. "Why are you doing this, Carter? Really? You could have walked away on day 1. I looked at my hands, calloused and stained with construction adhesive. I thought about the hollow, empty apartment I went back to every night. I thought about the transactional nature of every relationship I had. I looked back up at her, at the strength it took for her to stand under a failing roof and hold a level. I didn't tell her that she was the only real thing in my life. I didn't offer a confession. I offered truth, because I know how to fix it, I said simply. And because it's yours. She held my gaze for a long moment, the silence settling around us like a heavy blanket, blocking out the wind, the impending deadline, and the exhaustion. She didn't press for more. She understood the weight of what I hadn't said. She offered a small, weary smile, reached out, and handed me the utility knife. I took it, being careful not to let our fingers touch, relying on the discipline that kept me standing. I went back to work. At 9:45 a.m. the next morning, I was sweeping the last of the dust from the front porch. The exterior wall was sealed, wrapped, and weatherproofed perfectly. It wasn't painted yet, but it was structurally and environmentally impenetrable. A silver sedan pulled into the driveway. Mr. Vance stepped out carrying a clipboard. He was a man who wore his authority like a cheap suit, too tight and uncomfortable for everyone around him. He walked up the path, ignoring me entirely, heading straight for the front door where Amelia stood. She looked exhausted, pale, but she stood tall, her chin raised.
Miss Daniels,
Vance said, his voice carrying a practiced false sympathy. I see you've had some work done, but per the emergency notice, I stepped into his path, positioning myself between him and the doorway. I didn't puff out my chest. I just stood my ground, a physical barrier of canvas and calm. Mr. Vance, I said, extending my hand. He looked at it, then took it reluctantly. Carter Dunn. Dunn Contracting. I didn't wait for him to speak. I handed him a thick manila folder. Inside, you'll find the signed-off structural permit from the county, time-stamped at 8:15 a.m. this morning. You'll also find the engineer's letter verifying the load path exceeds current municipal code and a photographic chain of custody of the vapor barrier installation before the exterior sheathing went up. Vance blinked, opening the folder. He flipped through the pages, his frown deepening. This was supposed to be a total facade failure. The envelope was open. The envelope was secured at 4:30 a.m., I stated, my voice devoid of emotion, operating purely on facts. The property is weather-tight, structurally sound, and legally habitable. The municipal emergency clause is void. I pulled out a small laser level from my pocket and set it on the porch railing, projecting a perfectly straight red line across the new wall. It's also plumbed to within a 1/16 of an inch. If you'd like to bring in your own engineer to dispute the county sign-off, you are welcome to do so at your company's expense. But the lease remains active. Vance looked at the laser line, then at the stamped county seal on the permit. He realized he was outmatched. The bureaucratic trap he had relied on had been dismantled with absolute, measurable precision. He closed the folder. Fine, he clipped. He looked past me to Amelia. We'll be conducting our annual walkthrough next month, Ms. Daniels. You can schedule it through my contractor, Amelia said. Her voice was clear, ringing with a newfound authority. She didn't look at him. She looked at me. Mr. Dunn handles all property maintenance negotiations. Vance tightened his jaw, turned on his heel, and walked back to his car. I watched him drive away, the gravel crunching under his tires. I turned off the laser level and slipped it back into my pocket. The adrenaline that had kept me going for 24 hours suddenly evaporated, leaving a heavy, hollow ache in my bones. I turned to look at Amelia. She walked past the threshold, stepping out onto the porch. She looked at the new wall, running her hand along the clean, raw wood of the siding. Then she turned to me. The space between us was gone. There were no more deadlines, no more tools to hold, no more excuses to maintain the distance. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, heavy brass key on a plain ring. She didn't hand it to me. She stepped close, the scent of vanilla and rain surrounding me, and slid the key into the breast pocket of my work shirt. The weight of it settled directly over my chest. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was a transfer of trust. It was an arrival. You left your jacket here yesterday, she said softly, looking up at me. You'll need a way to get back in to paint this next week. I looked down at her. The urge to pull her in was a physical ache, a demand in my blood, but I held still. I wanted the choice to be hers, entirely and without pressure. I'll be back on Monday, I promised, my voice rough. Amelia didn't step back. She reached up, her hands resting flat and warm against my chest, right over the key. The transfer of stability was immediate. The spinning of the last 3 weeks stopped. I exhaled, a long, shaky breath, and lowered my forehead to rest against hers. We stood there on the porch, in the open air, a public choice witnessed only by the quiet street. I closed my eyes, feeling the solid, unbreakable reality of the house behind us and the woman holding me in place. I kissed her. It was heavy, grounding, and absolute. A seal on a promise. The wandering was over. Closing thoughts. Love isn't about grand, dramatic rescues or chaotic passion. It's about the quiet, consistent discipline of showing up, doing the work, and building a foundation that can actually hold the weight of real life. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this. The end.